With that, let's welcome Dr. Bronson Strickland from Mississippi State University. He is with MSU Extension and the MSU College of Forest Resources. He runs the MSU Deer Lab, and today Dr. Strickland will talk about balancing objectives and outcomes for wildlife habitat and forest management. Bronson, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, David. I appreciate the opportunity and appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone about a topic that is near and dear to my heart and something that I think is really important for people in the eastern U.S. as related to wildlife management. A quick preview of what I want to talk about today is I'm not going to get deep into the weeds on any of these topics here, but I want to start. It's probably going to be a review for a lot of people, but a little bit of the ecology of plant succession, why it's important. I think we need to understand the process if we're going to be able to manage the process. We're going to talk quickly about some of the common tools that we use for habitat management. And then, importantly, the last two things, we're going to move from theoretical to actually some case studies showing you how wildlife respond to plant succession and to wildlife habitat management. And lastly, how does it pay? How does it pay for itself? Can it pay for itself? And essentially, I want to end up there talking about the trade-offs. There's no free lunch. And so typically when you increase one, you decrease the other. And that is how we will wrap up the presentation. So a quick review of plant succession. And the way we think about this is just simply plant communities change over time. It's as simple as that. So those that are related have knowledge of forestry and forest practices after a clear cut. This could be after an agricultural field that's not planted again, but everyone knows that once the ground is disturbed, and if you walk away and come back a year, 2 years, 10 years, 50 years later, at least in the eastern U.S., you're going to have a forest. And that is what we call succession, is the replacement year after year and decade after decade, going from shade intolerant annual plants, and then we move into perennial plants and grasses, then we move to shrubs, softwood trees, and in a lot of places hardwood trees or mixed pine hardwood. So that is how succession happens in most of the eastern U.S. And along the way, so we have to think about how these systems evolved with disturbance over hundreds of years and thousands of years, is that you have different animals are associated with different parts of this continuum of plant communities. So, and let me admit from the get-go here, I am definitely have my experience and my clientele that I work with, I have a game management bias, and so many of the examples that I'll use today are going to be with bobwhites and rabbits and turkey and deer, but all of this stuff still applies to non-game species as well. But this is just what we have to keep in mind, is when a lot of people can't figure out on a particular piece of land, why is this animal not present? It's typically because of the habitat. The habitat's not there. Plant succession has happened or has not. And then what we use, we call forest management to mix these successional stages. And so if we have a goal or an objective to manage for a particular wildlife species, we have to go in and modify this regime here to get the right successional stage and plant species that we need. So that's really how this works. So conceptually it's pretty easy. Operationally it can be, a little more of a challenge. A couple other things to review, I think, that are important is we always have to keep in mind limiting factors. And, this is really important from Liebig's law of the minimum. And all that is we can just simply say you got to plug the lowest hole in the bucket. So even if you have all the resources that an animal needs, but you have that one critical resource is missing, then that animal population is going to be limited. That's going to be the limiting factor to keep that population from thriving. I like to teach people that limiting factors is kind of like human beings in our diet. I might be able to have everything that I want to eat and need to eat, but I might be missing one critical vitamin or element. I might be missing vitamin C. And that is going to limit me. Even though I have all these other things in abundance, if I'm missing that limiting factor, I'm not going to be healthy, and eventually I'm going to die. Another concept, and I'll contrast this a little bit with some different species, is tolerance to the environment. So there's always a sweet spot, like we call it maximum fitness. And what that means is that is the condition where that population, survival is good, reproduction is good, body sizes are good. That is where they are meeting all of their needs. And then when you deviate too far to the right or too far to the left on some of these needs, then you will see the population slowly responding. Body sizes will get smaller, clutch sizes will be smaller, survival will be less, and then eventually the species will go away from that particular area. Just a quick example here, and an extreme example is, there's a lot of limiting factors going on here for this deer, is that there's absolutely no food is being provided for this deer. Now, how can the deer exist? Well, it all depends on scale. So tolerance here is going to be affected by how much of this deer's home range looks like what is depicted in the slide. And so if it can move through it and find food somewhere else and cover somewhere else, then a deer can be tolerant to this type of forest stand, but it just can't compose a majority of the deer's home range. And when we work on this continuum of tolerance, I work with a lot of people who say, well, we see deer everywhere. Deer can live in just about any environment, and that's true in the eastern U.S. It just depends on, do you want good animal quality? Do you want high reproduction? Do you want bigger bodies, larger antlers, those types of things? And so if you look on this slide, at the very top, I'm calling that forest basal area, just a schematic, simple schematic, where on the left-hand side we have a very low basal area, relatively few trees. On the extreme right-hand side we see there's a lot of trees per acre. And as you move in terms of deer habitat quality from left to right, it just slowly descends. You will slowly descend from very high habitat quality to very low. Now when we contrast that with something like eastern wild turkey, notice the same relationship exists, but turkey habitat kind of declines at a faster rate. And so the deer can tolerate some of the lesser habitat quality that a turkey may not be able to tolerate. And then finally, most kind of emblematic of this relationship is northern bobwhites. And you essentially go from very high habitat quality when you're at this area of this continuum of trees per acre, and then eventually you end up to no habitat whatsoever. Not only is it low quality, you eventually just have no bobwhite habitat whatsoever. So that's a lot of different species are tolerant of a range of forest conditions, and some are not. And those are three species that kind of demonstrate that concept. Everything I'm going over today is fundamentally going to be related to this, and it is how much light is hitting the ground. And so often in the southeast we're dealing with pine trees, but something I want to urge, and I'm going to show examples of it, it does not matter if we're talking about a loblolly pine or a white oak or whatever type of forest stand you have. This fundamental relationship is the same, is that we are trying for a lot of the species, when I'm talking about species that need, at least for part of their life, they need early successional vegetation, we are constantly going to need to set back succession within forest stands so that we can provide herbaceous plants for food and cover. And just to experimentally show you that how this works is that if you see on the bottom here on the x-axis we have basal area, feet per acre. And just notice that as basal area is really high, and we see this very commonly in our forest today, when basal area is 100 or greater or 90 or 80, we get very little sunlight is going to penetrate the canopy and hit the forest floor. And then there's really this threshold that starts occurring when you're at about 65 and 60 and below, that now the canopy is really open and we get a lot of sunlight now start striking the forest floor and stimulating growth of herbaceous plants. And so we see the exact same relationship here. Now, rather than measuring sunlight, we have coverage of herbaceous plants. And notice again, when we get down to about this 60 and 50 basal area, everything changes. Now we essentially can get to what we want, which is we're kind of growing a prairie. It's like we're managing two things. We're managing a forest in the overstory, and we're managing a prairie in the understory. And conversely, as you might imagine, here's the relationship with bare ground. Now, bare ground, I don't mean just bare soil. We just mean no herbaceous plants are growing. As we exceed this threshold here of 50, 60, 70, we just start getting a greater proportion of the ground is now bare, meaning no plants are growing. So just a lot of pictures here to hopefully drive home this concept is that, you know, this is a fantastic stand here for growing loblolly pine. Stand looks very healthy. But you can see underneath that the shading that is occurring, and once you get beyond, you know, the edge of the stand where the sun is penetrating from the side, there's just really not much going on in terms of food or cover inside. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm not picking on pine trees whatsoever. The exact same thing occurs when you're in hardwood stands. You can actually see the browse line under here. Is that no food is being produced on the ground simply because of shade. This, on the other hand, is fantastic deer habitat, turkey habitat, bobwhite quail habitat. So notice there's enough opening in the tree canopy to get sunlight on the ground, and then Mother Nature takes care of the rest. Here's more of a production stand. Again, after a thinning and some treatments with herbicide, fire, etc., we see all this herbaceous plant community that's developing underneath the stand. Even in hardwood stands, these are some of the data I showed you earlier about the relationship with the basal area and light and herbaceous growth. So again, even with the hardwood stands, we can still thin and get sunlight on the ground, and have to. It's critical. Okay, what are our tools? I think everybody kind of sees the process of what we're doing. What are the common tools that we use? Well, we've come a long way since Aldo Leopold. He first described habitat management using the cow and the plow and the axe and fire, and people can still use that today, of course, but more commonly, these are the tools that people are using. So rather than an axe, for me, I'm going to be using a chainsaw. On an industrial scale, though, it's going to be a feller, a buncher, and a skidder. Me using herbicides, I'm going to be using a backpack sprayer, but industrial scales, they're going to be using a helicopter. And of course, the tractor and the disc is still important to disturb the soil, and prescribed fire has been and always will be one of the most valuable tools for habitat management to manage succession. So I'm going to give you an example here of, this is a very common scenario and what we have to deal with in the southeast. It's kind of a typical pine stand, and you'll begin to see here where this arrow is pointed is that we essentially have two layers in this forest. We have the overstory, which is our cash crop tree, and then we have this mid-story, that is composed primarily of shade-tolerant hardwoods. Now, is that necessarily hurting the growth of the pine trees? I think that's debatable. I think every situation is going to be a little bit different, and I think there are some extreme cases where it would pay to reduce or eliminate this competition for the benefit, of the pine trees. But one thing is for certain, is that there is nothing going to be growing underneath here that is going to benefit deer or turkey or bobwhites. So a common prescription is, how do we go in here and remove that mid-story component so that sunlight can get back on the ground? One way we do that is through a Imazapyr. An application here is by a skidder. It could be by helicopter. But basically, we're going through in the fall of the year, and we're spraying this to make sure we're going to get rid of the sweet gum, the green ash, and things like that. In some cases, when there's a lot of winged elm, some people will even add escort to this mix to kill that. Keep in mind, though, and I've learned this one the hard way, escort complements Imazapyr very, very well at cleaning up a stand with the hardwood competition. It will also, though, impact the response of some of your forbs and blackberry and things like that wildlifers would want in that stand. So you do have to trade something there if you add escort. So after we have sprayed the mid-story, then we're going to follow up. Most commonly, it's going to be through January or March. I would prefer, from a wildlife perspective, the later the better. If you could push it into April or May to get your burn, I think you're going to get a better response out of your forb community or your broadleaf plants. And this is the result that we see. This is a very small scale here we're looking at, but this is what happens. So these sweet gum were sprayed, and then we had a burn, and ultimately we're going to grow into something like this. Second growing season, and now we're in our fourth growing season, and then eventually at this level now you are just going to maintain this with prescribed fire. Just depending on, it's going to be site specific, it's going to depend on is the stand, are you really concerned about food, are you concerned more about cover, will determine the fire interval that you use. But that's kind of the process that we go through. Now let's look at kind of some measurements of what do we get when we actually measure the plant response. This is a study I want to cover here in brief from Dr. Ray Eagley in cooperation with Weyerhaeuser. And so within their commercial production stands, they were just looking at, what if we just don't do anything? That's a control. If we herbicide only, if we burn only, and then if we use fire and herbicide. And what we see is that we get a dramatic response after these treatments. The second year is really the big jump, and the clear winner is the burn and the herbicide, at least in these stands where we studied, or Dr. Ray Eagley studied. That was where they saw the greatest response. So you still see an impact from burning, you still see an impact from the herbicide, and a lot of this is going to depend too on, what is the plant community that you have there. But it was all greater than the control. And then notice slowly over time, here we had another burn, and here we had another burn, and every time we're burning, we're getting an uptick there in the response. And this is simulated. We're kind of taking, looking at the amount of forage that is produced, and we use this metric that we call deer days. And it basically just means if a deer had to live on an acre of land, how much food is there, how many days could a deer live on that particular acre of land. So it's a common metric that we use in the deer world. And so you'll notice here, if we have year, or this is kind of the age of the stand here, the timber stand at the bottom, notice that after planting, there's going to be deer days, there's going to be a lot of deer food, there's going to be a lot of deer cover, and then slowly as those trees begin to come together and the canopy closes, and now we're out of deer habitat. We have a thinning and deer habitat increases. And again, as those trees grow like they're supposed to do, the canopy closes again, and then another thinning, and it opens up. More sunlight hits the ground, and then the canopy closes together. And so that's kind of the cycle of, or the relationship that we see in pine stands. Now conversely, when we use something called a QVM technique, as quality vegetation management, we can greatly improve after that second thinning and through the life of the stand, depending on how hard we thin, how many trees we remove, which is related to, you know, how much canopy coverage are we going to have, how much sunlight's hitting the ground, and that will then greatly affect, you know, for 15 years or so, how much deer food is going to be produced and how we can improve carrying capacity. So that's just how we contrast that, depending on basically a couple things. It's going to depend on how hard did you thin, what basal area did you take it back to, and then did you incorporate prescribed fire. And often you may or may not have needed to also use a herbicide, but that's how you get this dramatic shift. Moving from a pine system, this is two colleagues of mine, Marcus Lashley and Craig Harper, in East Tennessee, and we see, again, the exact same relationship. I want to drive that point home. This isn't just a pine management technique, it is a forest management relationship. And so they have shelter wood cut here, that is SW, shelter wood and fire, retention cut and fire. And the things that I want to point out is that, so this again is pounds per acre. This is of the amount of deer forage that's produced. And then here we have our control. So these are control stands where they didn't do anything, just to measure the deer food. Then when they have similar stands paired up where they only burned, then they have the shelter wood. So they had the cut, but they did not follow it with fire or herbicides or anything. But look when you put these two together, and this is critical, is that you're not really giving fire the opportunity to provide the benefit to you and to wildlife if sunlight is not part of the equation. So burning under a shaded forest is not going to provide near the benefit as if you were doing prescribed fire in a stand where sunlight is allowed to penetrate the canopy. That is where you see these twofold and threefold changes in the amount of forage and cover that's produced on the forest floor. I got ahead of myself. What's the limiting factors I wanted to point out there? The limiting factor here was that with fire, when you used fire, sunlight was not in the equation. And here, sunlight was allowed to hit the ground, but fire was not in the equation. So those two definitely synergize, sunlight and fire. Okay, let's go to some wildlife responses now. A few little facts here for you to think about when I show you the next slide. About how much does an adult deer eat every day? Of course, this all depends on the size of the deer. So if you're talking about a 100-pound deer, it's going to be about 5 to 6 pounds if you include the water weight. Or if you were to do that on dry matter basis, about 3 pounds. When you look at these very typical forests that we have in the southeast, one that is not managed is producing very little forage for deer, about 100 pounds. Versus in a managed pine plantation or forest, you're going to have about 400 to 800, even to 1,000 pounds of food. So this is that relationship where we're talking about sunlight is affecting food. And how does food affect deer? So this is an analysis we did at the Deer Lab, heck, about 10 or 12 years ago. And what I want to walk you through here, and this is in southern Mississippi, what we call the lower coastal plain, every one of these dots here does not represent a deer. Every one of those dots represents a deer population. So we went to all these properties, and we measured what percentage of the property is in pine plantation. And so we're talking about a typical pine plantation management scenario where very, very little sunlight is hitting the ground. And on all these properties, you see the trend as we increase the proportion of the property that is in closed canopy pine forest, we decrease the antler size of bucks. Very, very clear relationship. And it's simply a product of food. Has nothing to do with the pine tree per se. It has everything to do with these properties here with below average antler size have very little sunlight on the ground at that property. I got this from my colleague Mark McConnell, and it was from Tall Timbers research, but the same fundamental relationship. On the x-axis down here is basal area. It's in metric, but that really doesn't matter. Just think of it, the more dense the forest gets, the less sunlight is on ground, and we see that covey call counts, which we assume is related to the abundance of bobwhites, decreases. Another study here, case study, Mark McConnell again shared this with me, but this was in my backyard here at the Noxubee National Wildlife Refuge in Mississippi. And just going to walk you through a few of the slides demonstrating what was going on. This is what the stand looked like pre-treatment, followed by a heavy thin. When you can see the thin from above, you know you have removed a lot of trees. So this is post-harvest, and this is what it looked like on the ground. And when you get a year or two down the road, you notice all the sunlight that is penetrating through the forest canopy. This is what the Mother Nature, how it responds. And so you see a great diversity of both forbs and grasses, and over time you'll see some woody sprouts come in here that could be food for deer and it can provide cover. But this is what now can just be maintained, depending on the fire interval, over time. How did bobwhites respond? Well, in 2007, pre-treatment, you see a very, very low response. And then look at the response 2 years later. Same for the eastern wood pewee, same for Bachman sparrow. So birds that need early succession vegetation, birds that won't need to walk on the bare ground and forage among plants while standing on the bare ground, this type of habitat is critical for them. So management works. Excuse me while I take a quick water break. Okay, I want to review now a study we are just wrapping up here in Mississippi on a demonstration property that we have. And it is basically, we're going to use trail cameras. We're going to let the animals essentially tell us where they enjoy spending time, where they bed, where they feed, where they nest, etc. What we have on this property, it is about, it's 550 acres. And what we have is first of all, a range of basal areas, and I'll show you some slides of that here in a moment. But I want you to keep in mind as we move from south to north, basal area goes from very, very dense to very less dense. So we're going from a basal area of about 80, give or take, to a basal area in the middle of about 60, give or take. And up here, these two stands at the top are a basal area of about 40, give or take. Within these treatments, we also looked at the effect of only using fire, that's in that light gray shaded, versus herbicide and fire. And so we're going to be able to look at where are animals spending time with these different habitat management techniques on these acres. What you see here, all of these little dots represent a camera location. From each of these camera locations, we of course monitored what wildlife were walking through and using it. We're also measuring the vegetation immediately around each of these locations. These are some examples, just very representative of the basal areas we're working with. So this is on the southern end of the property. It's going to be about 80 basal area. Of course, you know, this is real world, and when we had it, the thinning took place, there are a few spots that are a little less and a few spots that are a little more, but on the average we're about 80. Notice there was no treatment, no herbicide treatment, so we kind of have a two-story forest going here. We have a mid-story that has a lot of shade-tolerant hardwoods, and notice that the great amount of needles that we see on the ground. This is kind of characteristic of our 60 basal area. Again, some places are a little more dense, some are not, but that's kind of the average 60. This happens to be a stand here that was not treated with herbicide. It would only have fire through this stand. And lastly, on the north end of the property, you can already see the difference with the amount of sunlight that you see penetrating the canopy. This was our 40 basal area, and again, within the 40 basal area, we had a stand that was herbicide treated and one that was not. And so this was the stand that was not treated with herbicide. So I want to just lay this out one more time as we go from south down here to north up here. 80 basal area, 60 basal area, 40 basal area. And then within those treatments we have, they were only thinned, followed by fire, and they were thinned, sprayed with imazapyr, and had fire. So those are the treatments that are spread out all throughout the property that we're going to look at how the animals responded. Okay, I've got three critters I want to review. The first one you see up here at the right hand, this is cottontails, rabbits. And everywhere you see, well, this is called a heat map. So wherever you see the yellows and the orange and ultimately the red, this is indicating areas of the highest amount of use. And so notice when we're in the most intensive areas here, so this area here is where the basal area is lowest and where herbicide and fire were used. And even down here in the 60 basal area, as compared to the 80 basal area where we had 80 basal area and no fire, no herbicide, we see that animal activity is greater with lower basal area and more management intensity. How about wild turkey? We see the exact same relationship. We see that these animals are concentrating their use up in these areas where sunlight is on the ground and succession is being maintained by prescribed fire. And lastly, deer, following again the exact same relationship. Even though deer are more tolerant of a wider range of conditions in terms of tolerant of dealing with shade tolerant mid-story, they essentially have an option of where to spend their time, and when they have the option of spending their time in these more open stands and stands that where fire is being used to develop a more of an herbaceous community, that is also where deer are spending their time. These are all the different critters. You know, some of these may not be of interest to everyone here, but we just wanted to kind of catalog what, how all the animals that we got regularly on photographs were responding. And we see raccoon, cottontails, coyotes, possum, turkey, deer. Notice on this continuum on the x-axis at the bottom, control stands where we did nothing, stands where we had only fire, and stands where we had fire and herbicide. This is where we see indicated in blue, this is where for every species we see the greatest amount of activity. And just to show you a view from the above, this is our two 40 basal area stands. And like I said earlier, you know, when it's being thinned, sometimes the logger hit the mark, sometimes missed the mark a little bit. But you can literally see the contrast when you look over here to the left, and this is not our property, but it is owned by a timber company. And when you look from above, you can see that there's just really nowhere a bobwhite can live in that stand. There's a few places, a few canopy gaps where maybe a turkey can nest, but when you compare this regime of sunlight to soil, how sunlight is going to hit the ground versus what we have over here, the difference is like a night and day. So like I said earlier, we are simply managing a forest in the overstory and a prairie in the understory. Okay, we're going to wrap up here with the trade-off. No free lunch. You can't maximize your property to grow timber and expect to see a bunch of deer and to harvest Boone and Crockett bucks, or maximize timber value and simultaneously flush 20 coveys of bobwhite. So there's always going to be a trade-off between the economics of forestry as well as wildlife habitat, and that's just a fact. So we wanted to quantify that. So this is a paper, and I think it's on the website that David provided. And so if you want to get really into the economic weeds and details, this paper is available for you. But we wanted to look at really quantifying what the trade-off is. And so everything kind of comes down to these four things, and there's a lot more detail, but these are the big ones, is how are you going to manage basal area, which remember basal area and on the wildlife habitat side is a surrogate for sunlight. As basal area increases, you have more trees per acre, and you make more money per acre, but you decrease the amount of sunlight that hits the ground, and therefore you decrease wildlife habitat. We also have to assume that site to site, it's going to vary in terms of quality, site productivity. So we had to factor all that into our economic models. And then we had to look at the value. So in this case, we used loblolly pine. And so we used the 10-year average when we started this project. It was about in 2005, and so we used, or excuse me, it was about 2014, and so we used the previous 10 years. So we used average timber prices from 2004 to 2013, and then you have to also input your cost of treatments, management treatments. Herbicide in some cases can be used to benefit the growth of trees depending on the level of competition, but it's also a wildlife habitat management technique, and furthermore the use of fire is a habitat management technique. So these are all things that we can vary and look at over time, you know, over a 30-year window of a stand or over a 100-year planning horizon, what's going to be the differences in the economics. Just visually, these are the types of things we were doing. We kind of did a status quo, is what is more or less common in the industry of how a stand would be managed. It would be grown to whatever level and thinned back down to about 80 basal area and grown out, versus some that were thinned down to a basal area of about 50, and then others, like in our quail scenario, thinned down to a basal area of about 30. So it is very, very obvious that a stand up here is going to bring a more value from timber than this stand down here. But how much? So these are our results, and again, a lot more detail in the publication if you want to download it. But so we're kind of comparing everything. This is the deer results, and our site index, at 80, of 90, and of 100. So now we're looking at the value, you know, per acre. And so on this site index, we're looking at about, you know, $2,400. Now, if we thinned it to a basal area more conducive to deer, which say, you know, we're going to thin it down to say 60, a basal area of 60 versus 80, you know, we did lose some value. So now we're looking at about $1,500. So in a difference of about $912, and if you look at it over the price of the stand, that's going to be the compensatory dollar amount would be $27 per acre. Let me say that another way. Over the life, depending on, I think we use the 30-year rotation here, is that every year you would need to add an additional $27 on your lease to make up for what you lost. So this is what you are giving up to have greater deer habitat on your property. And the more productive the site, the greater the loss. So now we're at a very productive site, and you are losing. You know, this site is now, an acre is now worth $3,800, and you would need an additional $45 per acre to make up for that revenue that you lost. Now for quail, the situation's only going to get worse because we are removing even more. So we start out again with our $2,400 on a site index of 80. So we're starting out with $40 per acre difference, and eventually on the productive sites we're getting up to, you know, $60 differences. So you would have to figure out as a landowner or as a leaseholder is what you would want. Now what we do find out is that indeed a lot of this can be made up for. You know, within Mississippi we see huge variation in lease prices based on wildlife habitat. So someone could look at that, maybe not with quail, wouldn't be as often, but with deer on the previous slide, you might easily be able to get $20 more per acre with the right amount of habitat. One other thing to consider is another reason for the disparity here is that the cost of prescribed fire. So we had this fixed cost of $20 per acre is what we use, and so over the life of that stand, and depending on your fire interval, that was $20 per acre to burn, and then 3 or 4 or 5 years later, $20 more per acre. There are a lot of people, whether they be landowners or leaseholders, that would do this for free. So when you take that prescribed fire, the cost of hiring someone to burn out of the equation, these numbers become a lot less. Now here's another way to look at it. This is your trade-off. We just went through the dollar amount trade-off. You are losing money. If you can't make up for it with lease prices, you are without a doubt losing money. When you start managing for a lower basal area for deer or turkey or quail, etc. But I want you to look at the shaded area here, the shaded area under the curve. We kind of have a baseline here. I believe it's about 62 or 3 basal area is the red line. That's kind of where we're a threshold that we said you're getting out of good deer habitat. And if you looked at this continuum over a 100 years planning window, you only have 31 years out of that 100 where you had, quote, really good deer habitat. And now we see we have 48 years. And down here we have 88 years, just all depending on the regime of how we manage the regime. And it's even more bleak for bobwhites, much more bleak. It's as soon as heck, within 5 to 6 years after planting, the number of trees, the stems, of course it gets too thick, etc. We're out of bobwhite habitat. And then we have a final harvest, and essentially for the remainder of that stand, we're going to be out of bobwhite habitat. And then we regenerate a new stand, we have it a few years and a few years. So over 100 years, we only have about 13 years where you would even have any bobwhite habitat. Much less would you even have bobwhites. We don't know that. But then when we start planting, when we have managed with a different basal area, when we thin a lot heavier and bring it down, notice that we can get more years of bobwhite on the landscape, and in this case 75 years. So this again demonstrates in every way financially the trade-offs that you're going to have, and even when you look at over a property, the trade-offs you're going to have in habitat. So how should I manage my forest? And it really all depends on what you want. You have to determine what is most important to you. Are you an absentee landowner, or maybe you're not an absentee landowner, but if your sole motivation is dollars per acre, a really, really safe bet is going to be just manage for the greatest value for timber. But if you are getting value out of, whether it be inherent value in having fun and satisfaction, or value from your lease prices, you have a lot of different options of how you can manage these stands depending on what you want. And I'm just going to close here with a couple things. You know, the old saying, you can't see the forest for the trees. These are questions I get a lot, and hopefully after this presentation these will be really obvious to everyone. When I'm out and about, I don't think a week doesn't go by I get this question: what happened to our quail? And you know, the knee-jerk response is always it has to be the coyotes, or it has to be all the hawks we have now, it has to be the fire ants. And when you can't see the forest for the trees, the answer is obvious. What happens to all the quail is we don't have quail habitat in the southeast anymore. We have urban sprawl, we have no sunlight, we have no margins because of clean farming, we have pasture grass instead of prairie. So when you look at all this together, this makes up a majority of the landscape in the southeast, and none of these landscapes are good for quail. When you're riding down the road, why do you see so many deer adjacent to the highway? I guarantee you, if a deer could choose where it would want to feed, it wouldn't be by a busy highway. But the bottom line is because there's very little food in the forest. That is where they are going because of sunlight and because of succession. That is where early successional plants are being grown on the sides of those roads, and deer are seeking that area for food. More information about us. Again, I'm with the MSU Deer Lab. That's a unit at Mississippi State University. David said that this lab is a URL is on the page where we started, the web page. So go there, and all things deer and deer management can be found there. Publications, we have a link. You could see it right there, but if you click on that publications link, and we've got stuff about antlers and habitat and deer biology and all sorts of information for you there. We also have a podcast. Actually, almost a year ago, we started the Deer University podcast, and this is where we talk about all the big topics going on in the world of deer biology and management, and we even talk about some other stuff. We had even talked about wild hogs one time, and we even talked a little turkey one time, but mainly it's a deer-focused podcast that's not about hunting. It's not about deer hunting. It's about deer biology and management. We have a YouTube channel. This is kind of our newest endeavor that we are hoping to grow over 2018, but we've got a lot of different views. If you want to see, for example, down here, how much does a deer eat every day? If you were to go out and pick the plants to see how long it would take you to see what a deer eats every day, you can see stuff like that. So it's a YouTube channel. Go to YouTube and just search MSU Deer Lab TV, and it'll pop up. And of course on Facebook. This is how you can follow us on social media. So whenever we put up new videos, new publications, things like that, you can follow us on our Facebook page. And with that, David, if we have time, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Strickland. We appreciate all that you told us. Really good stuff. Folks, if you do still have questions, feel free to type them into the chat window on the lower left, and we will get started with some of the questions I have already. So, Dr. Strickland, first of all, you talked a little bit about the forest management in deer, and you had a slide that showed values about food production per acre, ranging from 100, I believe, pounds per acre up to 400 to 800, sometimes even 1,000. Was that per year, those values?
Yes, that is per year, with the assumption that you keep it managed. So you you would have that occur a year or two after treatment, and if you just walked away for the next 15 years without using prescribed fire to set back succession, those values would be a lot less.
Sure.
So that is under the assumption you were under some type of burning regime.
Okay. So we have a question here. Is the general thinning approach across a large area better than a more bifurcated approach with larger areas of prairie interspersed with heavier forest cover? And this got to something I was thinking about. If you have, you know, maybe a 1,000-acre tract and you wanted to split that up into different smaller tracts, I think the question is, how big a tract is really necessary to try to help some of these wildlife? Are you talking, you know, lowering the basal area on a 50-acre chunk, at least a 100-acre chunk, that type of thing?
That is an excellent question. It has a kind of a complicated answer. I'm going to try to generalize as best I can. So I want to think about the relationships we talked about with sunlight and managing for succession. You know, we have to have that at some level. You know, you wouldn't need as much to have a deer population. You would need a lot to have a quail population. But when we get to the economic results, let's think about this, is that there's going to be variation. So if you had your 1,000-acre stand, your 1,000-acre property or forest, and if there is variation in site productivity, what I'm probably going to do is the acreage that grows pine trees in this case really, really well, is I'm going to manage that more for pine trees for my financial investment. In areas where the site is not as productive, I personally am going to choose to either not have trees in there, period, or I can afford to have them at a much, much lower basal area and have greater wildlife habitat. What exactly that ratio is it's going to depend on the quality that you want, how many animals you want, and their quality. And we also, David, regarding that is, I didn't really have time to get into this, but we have to think about time when we're staggering as well. So if you remember those graphs from the economic side of it, is that we don't have to, you know, treat that entire 1,000 acres at the same time, is that we could have different operations going in on 5-year intervals. And so we're staggering those different levels of succession throughout the stand so that within our 1,000 acres, we always have deer habitat or always have turkey habitat.
Right, and one thing I'll point out is when you're doing some of these management activities, eventually you'll get to the harvest. The smaller the tract, sometimes the more difficult it is to find someone to come in and take that tract. And I'm thinking usually under 40 to 50 acres, you can sometimes have trouble getting a company to come in. They're not going to want to come in for 20 acres to thin. It's going to need to be a larger chunk than that. So that's also something to keep in mind, is just the pure economics of it all.
And David, that's kind of our recommendation. That is our recommendation as well in terms of a management unit related to the forestry side. Is we never think of treatments smaller than 50 acres for that very reason.
Okay. Next question. There's several here. One of the largest problems managing for quail and deer at 50 basal area in pine is mid-story brush encroachment. I've used fire, brush control, timber harvest, and herbicide, all at a cost. Can you talk about if it's better to slowly try to convert pine stands into this 50 basal area with herbaceous stuff, as opposed to losing a stand in the mid-story and a large-scale treatment requiring more intensive management? Did you get all that?
Could you? There was a break in communication for a second. Could you repeat the last half of it, David?
Yeah, so we talked about using fire, brush control, timber harvest, and herbicide all at cost. Can you talk about if it's better to slowly try and convert a pine stand into a 50 basal area with herbs, as opposed to losing a stand in mid-story and a large-scale treatment requiring more intensive management?
Gosh, I don't know if I can generalize an answer there. It might be really more site-specific, and it might depend on the level of hardwood competition. We have always been successful treating it, at our depends on the first thinning or the second thinning and so forth, but whether it be helicopter application or skidder application, we have always been wonderfully successful if you use the appropriate level of imazapyr. And times in the past where I've seen where the hardwood control was not good was that the rate per acre was not appropriate, and so they only got a marginal kill or half kill. We have always had success of getting, I don't know, 99% kill, and especially if you add the escort into your tank mix. So I guess I can really only answer that with my experience, is that we've always been able to knock it out in a single treatment, and then when we follow it with fire every 3 to 5 years, we can maintain it.
And I would just concur. It's stuff like that is really a site-by-site issue, depending on sort of what kind and how many non-pine things you've got in there, if they're natives or invasives and all that type of thing. Are prescribed burns conducted by non-professionals really safe for surrounding properties and wildlands? Are they regulated? If so, by whom? I'll take this one, answering on behalf of Bronson, and we are both answering on behalf of the university system. We do not recommend prescribed burns be conducted by non-professionals, but those conducted by professionals, like your state forestry commission, they handle all of that stuff. They will give the burn permits for folks. If you do happen to know what you're doing, you can get a burn permit. But in general, the state or the federal entity, if you're on maybe federal land, they will be the ones that do those burns. And a prescribed burn by nature follows a very specific set of things. Think of it as a recipe, and those are safe. If it's an unsafe condition, you won't have a prescribed burn. So take-home message, let the professionals do it. At the very least, consult with professionals when you're doing something like that. We had a question, couldn't a program like the Wild Horse Fire Brigade, Horses Eat Fuel, help manage land along with prescribed burn? And adding to that, would horses eating the fuel negate the need for herbicides? Now, I personally don't know about the Wild Horse Fire Brigade, but it sounds like it's a bunch of horses that are eating the underbrush, almost like we've got the goats we use for the invasive species, the chew crew. I think that's probably what we're talking about. And I think the question is, could you use those along with the prescribed burn to try to reduce herbicide usage?
Yeah, I think I don't think of wild horses, but what used to be done, what was commonly done in the southeastern U.S. was the piney woods cow, and the way cattle were basically free-ranging. Any type of herbivore that would eat the woody components would be fine. I mean that would be fantastic. If it was kind of like Aldo Leopold used to say, the cow and the plow to manage succession, is that they would use livestock grazing, to manage succession. So yeah, is that theoretically possible to use an herbivore like that? Then absolutely. The unfortunate thing about it with the deer is that deer typically aren't going to eat that level of woody browse. They just it's just not as palatable to them. But if you had an herbivore that would knock it out, yeah, I think that would work.
Great. I had a question about some of the understories. We have a lot of invasive species, and I think this is the last question we'll take. We're getting late. I want to get people their CFE links. But so just to wrap up here, a lot of understory in the southeast is invasive plants. How does that affect deer? I would assume on the surface the invasive stuff is less palatable than the native stuff. But can you talk a little bit about how, if you've got something that's really crawling with invasives versus a chunk of land that's got a lot more native stuff, how that would affect deer or other game animals?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's some things that we've seen before, of course. And yes, it does affect things. And David, what you would have to do is stand by stand or within a stand is now the game gets a little trickier. Now you probably have to start adding other tools. You'd have to look at what is that invasive plant and what's the best way to control it. And it might be using even something like glyphosate, a general herbicide, just anything that's green and growing, I'm just going to have to kill everything and start over. It might be something that over time, with burning, over time that the native plants will eventually outcompete them. So I would probably have to find out what the plant is, learn a little bit more about the ecology of that specific invasive plant, and devise a plan for it.
Fair enough. Everybody, we're going to push out the CSE link right now. I want to again thank Dr. Strickland for taking the time with us today. If we didn't get to your questions, I apologize, but I'm sure he'd be happy to answer that if you would like to get a hold of him through his MSU Deer Lab webpage. Dr. Strickland, thank you very much. And folks, hang on. I will push this thing out momentarily. Are you still on, Bronson?